Hello and welcome, friends. Till now, we have discussed some important provisions of Industrial Policy 1991. We talked about how international trade was liberalized, how it was made easier for companies to import foreign technology and to pay royalty for that, to bring in technical experts from foreign countries, and to import various goods and services from foreign countries. We also talked about how public sector role was now limited to only a few sectors after the 1991 industrial policy. We talked about delicensing, which happened in so many sectors. In these sectors, there was no more any requirement of obtaining licenses before starting operations. So we have discussed quite a few elements of the industrial policy of 1991. We now know that the acronym LPG stands for liberalization, privatization and globalization, and we have discussed these aspects. As far as trade liberalization was concerned, this was an element of globalization because it helped India integrate more strongly with the rest of the world. As far as the decision to sell away loss-making PSU is concerned, this is related to privatization and the provision of delicensing, which was affected in some of the sectors, and opening up more and more sectors for the private enterprise. This was basically related to the liberalization aspect of the industrial policy 91. Now we are going to discuss some of the features which are yet to be discussed. So as far as foreign investment is concerned, what were the provisions in the IP 1991? See, as I told you, IP 1991 is basically known for LPG. G stands for globalization, which meant India was slowly trying to integrate with the world economy, and that meant allowing more and more foreign investments from foreign countries. And this is what we will see here when we will be talking about the provisions of the Industrial Policy 1991 as far as foreign investments are concerned. Up to 51% was permitted in high priority industries if foreign equity covered the forex requirement for capital goods imports. Earlier, the provision was that the industries in India should be majority owned by the Indian nationals, but then there was a relaxation which was given in this particular provision also, and now up to 51%, that is majority ownership, was allowed to be in the foreign hands, provided the foreign equity covered the forex requirement for capital goods import. What do we mean by this? The foreigner partner who is now taking a stake of 51% in a particular entity will naturally bring in some foreign exchange. He will use that foreign exchange to buy this 51% stake. So if the foreign exchange brought by the foreign partner covers up the foreign exchange requirement for purchase of capital goods from outside, then this was allowed. I'll give an example. Supposing, just to make you understand, supposing, let's say that we have come up with a firm and the worth of the firm is 100 rupees. The foreign partner has chipped in with 51 rupees because up to 51% only is allowed, so he cannot invest more than that. So up to 51 rupees have been invested by the foreign partner. Now this would be allowed only if the amount of money spent in buying capital goods from outside, from foreign countries, is less than 51 rupees. So this way what will happen, the government will be net earner of foreign exchange. The country's economy will be net earner of foreign exchange, and we would be able to save our forex reserves. So the whole idea behind this particular provision was to ensure that in high priority industries we receive some investment, plus we also wanted that our forex reserves should be safe. We should not be spending them in purchasing goods from outside, be it the capital goods or be it other kinds of goods required for the operations. So we didn't want to spend our own forex reserve for purchasing these kind of goods from outside. So we said, if the foreign partner is bringing in the money and that money can be utilized, that foreign exchange that he is bringing can be utilized to purchase these items from abroad, then only we are going to allow this kind of an arrangement. Then again, if the 51% stake is with the foreign partner, naturally he will have to be paid some dividend also. You know, the dividend is basically the payment made to the shareholders. So naturally the dividend will have to be paid to the foreign partners also. And now this was also allowed. If you have a look at what has been shown here, dividend payments to foreign shareholders was allowed. So all those foreign shareholders who are owning some portion of the shares of the company, they could now be paid dividends. So this again was some kind of a relaxation. And then what happened in 1996? I have mentioned this in red because it was not part of the industrial policy 1991, but it has been mentioned here to just let you know that the Indian economy slowly and slowly became more open and more integrated with the global economy. Have a look at the provision which was brought in here: automatic approval for foreign equity participation up to 51% in 16 industries. Up till now, till 1991, it was not allowed. In 1991, the policy allowed 51% permission for 51% partnership, 51% contribution by the foreign entity. But then in 1996, what happened? We started according such arrangements automatic approval, which meant that they didn't have to come and apply to the government. They were deemed to have been given approval automatically, right? And this was done with 16 industries. These 16 industries, the foreign equity participation is 51%. For that, they don't have to take any approval, and the approval was deemed to have been automatically given. So this was how Indian economy was integrated more closely with the global economy, and this now is an example of globalization of the Indian economy. Then this provision regarding MRTP Act, I hope you remember what you have read about MRTP Act last year in your second semester, Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act. So this was an act actually formulated and implemented to ensure that there are no monopolies in our economy, because monopolies tend to exploit customers. So the whole objective was to ensure that the monopolies don't get created here in our economy. And to ensure that this could be done, the government did what? It set limits for how many quantities, how much can be the production volume, how much of the quantities can be produced, whether expansion can be done or cannot be done, can a firm expand its operations. So all these things were basically taken care of by the MRTP Act. The companies which were large scale enterprises and which were considered to be a threat to the customer interests because they were likely to become monopolies, they were brought under the purview of this MRTP Act. And for every expansion of capacity, for increasing volumes, for starting a new business unit, for every aspect of this sort, they had to take permission from the MRTP Commission. Right? Now the provisions of MRTP Act were relaxed in 1991, and earlier there was need for approval whenever, as I said already, whenever there is a plan to start or set up a new business unit, or to expand capacity in the existing unit, or to merge the unit with some other unit, or two companies coming together and merging, or the directors getting appointed. So for all these aspects, earlier there was a provision that the government's approval has to be taken. However, in 1991, what happened? The provision regarding compulsory government approval before indulging in any of these four, that particular provision was removed. That particular provision was basically relaxed, and now the firms didn't have to apply for prior approval whenever they are setting up a new unit or expanding capacity, increasing their capacity, merging with some other firm, or appointing their directors. So in that sense, Industrial Policy 1991 relaxed the provisions of the MRTP Act. Then what are the other features? Foreign investment, we have discussed. MRTP Act, how the provisions were relaxed, that we had discussed. Now we need to talk about the failures of the Industrial Policy 1991. What was the reason? What all were the failures of the Industrial Policy 1991? What it aspired to achieve but could not achieve? What it aimed at but could not realize? This is what we are going to discuss now. So basically, this is to prepare you for those questions which ask you to do a critical analysis of the policy. So therein you don't only have to write about the policy, you have to give a little background, like I have given you about the 1980 industrial policy and the reasons why India had to unveil a new industrial policy in 1991. You would remember our discussion about Indian gold being mortgaged with IMF and India being on the cusp of a balance of payment crisis, and then political instability at the center, and then the IMF conditionalities attached with their assistance to India. So these were the basic reasons why we had to go for Industrial Policy 1991. So that was basically the background. And then you basically write about the policy, the provisions that we have already discussed. However, the answer would only be complete when you also make an assessment of how successful the industrial policy has been in achieving its stated objectives. So here we are going to discuss the failures of Industrial Policy 1991. First big issue was, if you would remember, let me go back a little bit and you would find out that we had discussed how Industrial Policy 1991 allowed you to obtain investments from foreign countries. Right, we have discussed this. I am going to that particular slide where we discuss this. See, have a look at this particular slide. So, as far as foreign technology was concerned, automatic approval were to be granted, majority foreign ownership in trading firms, liberalized import authorization. So basically this led to the Indian market being flooded with the foreign made goods, and Indian firms, since up till now they were used to competing only within the country. The country till 1991 was not open. Our economy was a closed economy, and we were less integrated with the global economy. There were restrictions on imports and exports, because of which by 1991 the firms which were operating here in India, they were in the habit of competing only with the other domestic firms. Naturally, they were not prepared to face competition from firms from other countries which spend a much bigger amount on R&D, on bringing up the most innovative products, on looking for the best of the technologies or the most cutting edge technology, and then trying to satisfy the customer. So when these firms came to India, they started selling their wares. The domestic firms in India, some of them faced a lot of problems. They could not simply withstand competition from these foreign firms. One example which comes to my mind is Videocon. Videocon, if you look at the figures till 1988-89, you would find that Videocon was a leader in the television markets. At that point of time, the technology that they were using was the cathode ray tube, and they were using these cathode ray tubes in their televisions, and they were the market leaders at that point of time in the Indian market. I remember at one particular point of time before 1991, they had a market share of almost 80%. However, when the Indian economy opened up and we started having foreign-made products, the foreign-made products started getting imported. Then what happened? Videocon was simply not able to withstand this competition, and it lost out the market share to the new entrants, which included foreign companies like LG and from Korea, Sony and Samsung, and so on and so forth. So Videocon was simply not able to compete with them. And now if you look at the market share today, and you would find out that if you talk about the Indian market, you would find out that Samsung and Sony and the LG, they are the market leaders, and Videocon does not figure in the top 5 market players. So this is one major issue. Some of the businesses, some of the indigenous domestic homegrown businesses simply could not withstand the competition from foreign market players. Then there was one more issue. Foreign capital was not restricted to just high priority sectors. If you recall, we had discussed that foreign investment in high priority sectors were allowed up to the extent of 51%, and this we have discussed in this session also, in the last session also. And basically the provision in Industrial Policy 1991 was to allow foreign capital, but only in high priority sectors, because these were the sectors which were very, very important for the economy. And it was thought that if we allow the foreign capital to participate in these sectors would develop, and ultimately this would secure the future of the Indian economy. So we allowed foreign participation in these kind of sectors. However, the low priority areas also witnessed a huge inflow of foreign capital. So though the provision was meant to allow foreign capital only in high priority sectors, we instead received foreign investment in low priority areas also, including in clothing, ready to eat food products and other sectors like that, right? For example, MACD entered India. We had also Coca-Cola re-entering India after quite a time period. So they were also able to come and invest here in India, and they were not part of the priority sector. So that was the problem. So this provision was meant only for priority sectors, high priority sectors, but then it was misused by low priority areas also, and we did receive investments in low priority areas also from foreign entities. Again, as far as the privatization drive was concerned, it was said that the loss-making PSUs would be privatized. However, the targets that were set, they were mostly not met. They mostly remained unmet. So the offloading means selling off the stake. So offloading targets could not be realized. And we have seen that how in Industrial Policy 1991, it was said that the SIC and low priority PSUs, which are not high priority for the country, they would be sold away to private enterprises. However, this could not happen to the extent promised by the Industrial Policy 1991. One reason was huge opposition from the labor unions which were working in these units. So the labor unions which were working in these units, they opposed this move by the government, and because of which the offloading targets, the target to sell off the government stake on these loss-making units could not be achieved, could not be realized. And why were the labor unions opposing? Labor unions were opposing because they knew that if a new management takes over, and it would be basically a private enterprise which would take over, they would be more concerned with the profit motive, and they may go on to then exploit the workers just to increase their profit levels. So that was one concern that the labor unions had, and they opposed it. Then in many places, however, the public sector units were actually sold to private capital. However, the transactions that took place were very, very shady. There was a perception which started developing that public assets are being sold to private sector enterprises at dirt cheap prices, throwaway prices. And this is happening because of the bureaucratic collusion. So there's a collusion between the prospective buyer and the bureaucrats who have the authority to decide which buyer to pick and at what price to sell the government asset, the public sector asset. So there was a collusion between the two, because of which the assets were sold at throwaway prices to private sector enterprises. One example is of the UP State Cement Corporation, which was again a government PSU, a state PSU. It was sold to the Dalmia Group, but when it was sold at 1/6 of its asset value. So the SICK PSU was sold to the private entity, but it was sold at 1/6 of the asset value, and there was a perception that went around that Dalmia Group has probably bribed the bureaucrats who were supervising the sale process, who were supervising the privatization process, and they were able to extract a dirt cheap price from them by probably bribing them. So this was the perception that went around, and in some cases it led to widespread opposition against such privatization moves by the government. So in some places the selling away of the public sector enterprises to the private sector was opposed, and a new model was developed. In this particular model, rather than selling to some private entity, government started selling the PSU to the employees, to the workers. And the idea was that the workers, since they have been handed over the PSU and now the PSU is their property, they are the owners of the PSU, of the public sector enterprise. And if somehow the property is not able to do well, if the PSU is not able to do well, if it is not able to earn any profits, ultimately it would be the workers that will have to lose out. And so the management, the operation, the functioning of the PSU was handed over to the workers so that they can be more motivated to work to improve the prospects of the SICK PSU. One example is of the Kamani tubes. Here the ownership was sold to the employees and the management was also handed over to them, and it was left to them to manage the enterprise rather than selling the enterprise to a private entity. So this is another main issue with Industrial Policy 1991. Either the SICK PSUs could not be sold, or whenever they were sold, they could not be sold in a very private, in a very transparent manner. Right? Again, the main criticism of the Industrial Policy 1991 is the jobless growth. Why do we call it a jobless growth kind of a scenario? Please understand, as India opened up its economy and went for the new Industrial Policy 1991, gradually India's growth rate started increasing. There's no doubt on that count. So industrial growth of overall GDP started increasing. Growth of overall GDP quickened. The space of the growth increased. However, there was no commensurate increase in the jobs in the economy. So there was increase in GDP growth. However, there was much less increase in the number of jobs which are available for the unemployed youth. And so it led to a period of jobless growth. Jobless growth meant that GDP is growing, however it is not translating into more number of jobs for the unemployed youth. So it was a period of jobless growth. One reason why this happened was that we could not come up with a labor intensive economic growth model. Labor intensive economic growth model would mean we are relying and we are encouraging, stimulating, we are helping assisting those industries which were more labor intensive. Such industries include, if you talk about the sectors, you understand that secondary sector is far more labor intensive than the service sector. So sector wise, we could not encourage manufacturing sector or the secondary sector. Again, within the manufacturing sector, there are some particular businesses, some particular industries which require a lot of workers. For example, one example that could come to your mind is the textile sector. Textile requires a lot of workers. Again, if you talk about gems and jewelries, again a lot of workers. If you talk about leather products, again it requires a lot of products. So we should have focused on these kind of labor intensive industries, and we should have encouraged them, we should have incentivized them. This incentive was missing, because of which the labor intensive industries in India could not grow at a fast pace. And if you talk more generally or more comprehensive terms, you can say that the manufacturing sector could not grow in India at a very fast pace, because of which we could not generate the number of jobs which were required here in India every year, and this ultimately led to a big problem of unemployment in the country. So this is one of the major criticisms of the Industrial Policy 1991. Now that we have completed the Industrial Policy 1991, you have a brief idea of the Industrial Policy 1956 also. Then I talked about the background behind 1956 IP and 1991 IP. We also talked about the various provisions in IP 1991. In the next session now, we will be moving over to industrial sickness, because industrial sickness is something that is very much prevalent, that is seen quite often as far as the businesses are concerned. So we have to basically talk about industrial sickness and what all provisions are there in our country to tackle industrial sickness. Okay, thank you.